Yeah, I was just grabbing the link.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, thank you so much for coming along to this. And we've got together such a sort of great mix of people. So before we get started, I just wanted to sort of introduce what we're doing with the Ministry of Eco Education before I kind of introduce our kind of panel discussion for this evening. The Ministry of Eco Education is a sort of educational project funded by the Green Britain Foundation, kind of linked with Dale Vincent, founder of Ecotricity. And very much what we're trying to do is support schools to embed sustainability across their curriculum by making the most of all of the things that already exist. So we've sort of found all of the great opportunities and resources, and we're weaving them together into a framework that helps support schools so that they can embed this within their existing curriculum. And we've been on this journey for about 3 years. We've kind of started in primary and have sort of been evolving this. We're now supporting more than 3,000 schools across the country. Of those, about 200 we've physically visited, and then we've met staff from nearly 1,000 of those schools. So in terms of impacts, we kind of really feel like there's a wave of momentum building. And we're very much trying to amplify all of the great stuff that's happening out there and the organizations and best practice in schools. So that's a little bit about who we are. In the audience, we've got Meryl, who is a part-time science teacher, who's also part of the Ministry of Eco Education team, and she's based up in Northumberland. And we also have Tom, who's based over in Bristol, and we've got Nirvana in London. So our team's sort of growing, and we're reaching out and collaborating. This is an example of a sort of series of events that we've been running as well, where we're trying to convene discussions and have debates and sort of stir what's been going on in education. Just some examples of other things we've got going on before we kind of delve into the discussion. So between Meryl and I, we've been creating this series called Education for Sustainability 101, and we're hoping it really is a summary of what educators need to know about what's going on in certain kind of aspects of education for sustainability. So far we've released energy, water, and this one nature, and it's very much a kind of 10-minute potted summary of all of the organizations and resources and people, and it's kind of everything maybe an educator might need to know as to what they might put into their teaching. This one we're just about to go live with, which is called Climate Calls, and this is our kind of what on earth do you do with COP28? Well, we thought maybe we could have some conversations with people who are out there and bring them to educators in the UK. So that's something that we're going to start to go live with over this week and next week, having some interesting conversations with people out there at COP28 in Dubai. So thank you again for coming along. And this is such a wonderful group of organizations, and I kind of honestly say that everyone who we've managed to get together today have been people I've kind of admired over the last couple of years, and really sure, like they've been doing some really interesting things, and so it's great to get everyone together in the room. Here's just a kind of a summary of some of those organizations. What I also then wanted to do is I'm just going to bring our speakers kind of into view for everyone. And then what I'm just going to do is introduce everyone as well. And a couple more just to add. So we're very fortunate, first of all, to have Paul Atkin. And Paul is kind of a really well-known character in education and the trade union movement, but also within the climate space. So Paul is a former teacher. He currently convenes the NEU Climate Change Network. He's editor of the Greener Jobs Alliance newsletter. He's sort of been politically active in one thing or another since helping set up a branch of Friends of the Earth back in 1971. And Paul's got a really good blog called Urban Ramblings. We're also joined by Morgan Phillips, who comes from or sort of represents Global Action Plan. He's the head of education and youth engagement. And Global Action Plan is tackling the root causes of the climate and nature crisis through research campaigns and collective action that reconnects human and planetary health. Morgan also is a climate change adaptation advisor at the Glacier Trust, and particularly I know over COVID was really actively involved and also authored a great book that everyone should read. And it's the Glacier Trust is a UK charity that enables remote mountain communities in Nepal to adapt to climate change. We also have Rowan Ryrie, who represents Parents for Future UK. She's the co-founder and an ongoing organizer with the organization, which is actually the biggest parent climate movement in the UK. And it's definitely growing fast. And Parents for Future value diverse ideas and voices, and they've built a really supportive, inclusive and thriving community, both online and offline. And that's something that's kind of I've definitely witnessed over the last few months in particular, that really grassroots growth. We've got Amrita, who is representing Teach the Future. She's a student volunteer. And Teach the Future is an inclusive and well-organised and persistent campaign by secondary and tertiary education students to greatly improve education on the climate emergency and ecological crisis in the UK. We've also got Emma, who is a climate activist and human being. I think that's really refreshing. Taking action to stop new fossil fuels. Emma is also a trustee with Students Organising for Sustainability, or SOS UK. Emma, I think you're based down in Exeter as well. Alison, or Alison Body, you are based at the University of Kent, senior lecturer in the School of Social Policy, Sociology and Social Research, and also a member of the Centre for Philanthropy. And Alison's interested in the intersection between the third sector and state. And her publications cover topics such as youth participation, voluntary action in primary education, fundraising in schools, the co-production of public services, and most recently, children's perception and experiences of charity and charitable giving. We also have Emily Grossman, who is representing Scientists for XR. She's a science author, broadcaster, and co-founder of Scientists for Extinction Rebellion. And this is one of the ways that I've really kind of understood Emily's work, is she compiled Emergency on Planet Earth, which I think is kind of one of the best summaries of the academic kind of research and science around the climate and nature emergency. That's a really useful tool for all educators. But she's also more recently been, she's a writer and consultant, and has worked on the BBC Bite-Size programme, The Regenerators, and I'm sure everyone's sort of seen lots of the great content that's come out of that. She also has released, I think, more than one book, and maybe that's something that Emily, four books, best-selling science books for children, and those include The World Whizzing Facts, which aims to help young people understand and make sense of the climate change and wildlife loss, and discusses what they can do to help. And Emily was really keen to make sure that everyone understood. She comes and does talks in schools, so please tap up Emily to come and speak in your school. So what we've got is an overwhelming panel here, with so much experience, and hopefully in the next sort of hour we can really get through some interesting discussion. What I wanted to do is to just set a context for this discussion and this debate. So the discussion is around the idea of activism in schools, and I hope everyone realised that was a slightly kind of clickbait topic and kind of framing of it. Both because activism is often seen as a sort of dirty word, particularly in education. Many educators feel uncomfortable with the use of that sort of term. And they might rather talk about things like champions or eco-warriors. What we also have is the prevent agenda that has made teachers really conscious of what they can and can't say. And there's a real focus on teacher impartiality. We also, this whole context of calling it activism in schools, I think we've got to think more broadly, and that might be something that we talk about is actually schools within education and education as a broader sort of system. We also then have the backdrop of COP28 and, the daily sort of headlines coming out of that. We've got the impacts themselves of the climate crisis, which have only been intensifying. We also then live within quite a divided society. We've got fascism and populism on one kind of side, and that maybe is versus some sort of eco-socialist future. Schools themselves also are in a position of crisis. That might be to do with funding or recruitment. It could be to do with the buildings themselves. So what we have is a really complex picture here. And I think there's, it's always a great moment to be able to explore this, to think more broadly about activism in schools. So before we get going, I did also just want to mention that in the audience of these sorts of events, we always have such a great mix of experience and stories. And, we already know that we've got such a big panel. And what we wanted to do then was give everyone an opportunity to sort of share their projects. And so that those of you in the audience, if there are stories and sort of things that you know of, I've just shared a document there, and please, take a moment during the discussion to be able to throw in your sort of, anything you wanted to share in terms of projects that you might be involved with or things that you know of. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat as well, and we'll sort of draw on those and bring those into the discussion. So to start with them, we wanted to start with this question of what do we mean by activism? And what I might do is just throw it over to Morgan to start with, if that's all right.
Thanks, Paul. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here and brilliant panel, and so great to see so many people on the call as well, joining. What is activism? I don't know if I classify myself really as an activist in the kind of conventional way, because the way I understand it is that it's kind of sort of vigorous campaigning, I guess, of some sort towards creating political or social change in some format. So, and that tends to take the form of protests and actions and petitions and so on, which quite often young people can get involved with, but I think it's normally framed as quite an adult activity which people do in their spare time and don't tend to do so much in their work, or are prevented to do in their work or school life. So just a short answer from me that it's kind of campaigning of some sort to create political or social change.
Okay, I might pass over to Paul.
I think I'd sort of like to look at this from the point of view of the fact that we're campaigning in an odd sort of political space, because the government, if you want to take up an issue that cuts with the grain of government policy, say Ukraine, that's fine. If you want to take up an issue that cuts against the grain of government policy, say Palestine, that's not. Kids get referred to prevent, so forth. If we're dealing with climate, we're somewhere in the middle, because what we're doing is we're trying to, if you like, implement the government's own targets and objectives that they're signed up to, despite their failure to actually have adequate policies to reach those targets, as has been done with the courts. So in a sense, we're in a kind of grey area in which it's possible to have whole institutional buy-in to a really progressive position, but we haven't won that at the level of society yet, or government, and that's the big challenge in a sense. So we've got that combined job to do, to actually win it at national level and try to do what we can now in the situation we've got. I'll stop rabbiting because I'm going on.
I think that's useful, though. You're sort of putting it in the context of that national government situation. Okay, Emily, shall I throw it over?
Oh, sorry, were you throwing to me?
Yes, Emily, yeah.
Yeah, the reason I put my hand up is just because I wanted to introduce my husband, Kinway, who I've asked to join us, and he can only stay for another 10 minutes or so. But he's also a climate activist and very active in this particular sphere, and also works with young people. So I know that he's got some insights on this particular topic that I thought would be really helpful to add.
Okay, so I'll slightly derail the order of things, but Emily and I were just talking about this panel earlier, and so one of the things that we were talking about is we're coming to this definition of activism, that it's any kind of strategic action that leads to change. So to aim to create change is one thing, but one could get up and stand and shout and scream, and it might not be strategic. Or one could use one's power to go on a peaceful protest, or to petition the school to create a rewilding area on the green fields in the playground. So there's these actions that are both strategic and aim to create change, and we were thinking of that as a definition of activism. Now, I'll just speak very briefly and then head on, but because I have to teach at 7. But I teach with the University of West London in music, and I'm also with XR Music. And in arts and in science, one of the things that we notice in educating as students is that when their specific area of interest in study will prohibit them having a career, then the act of study becomes activist. So, I have 3 particular students that I can think of who focus their final major projects on climate change and or activism. And one of them got back in touch recently, a year later, said, oh no, in my band, we had to abandon that climate stuff, in order to be commercially viable. And another says, I've gone 100% into activism, and I realized that means I probably will never have a music career. And a third has gone into community activist music. So there's this sense in which if you notice that what the students want to learn is prohibiting them having a career, then something is wrong. And it turns what is the normal order of a study and the desire to become part of a new society that moves things forward. When that's activism, something's very seriously wrong. I think that's probably all we have to say.
Thank you so much. That's you've pushed us in a certain direction. I think that's really interesting. That we often talk about that idea of how much of education is activism itself. The form of learning and becoming kind of positively engaging with the world around you and becoming an active citizen. How much of education itself is activism. And if you start to artificially remove these things and say activism is this other thing, then what are you doing to education itself? What is the process of a school and education? Ali, I'll throw it over to you.
So we look at this very much. So my research is very much based within the primary sphere. So I'm really interested in what's happening at primary education. And I suppose I approach this topic looking at it as a part of kind of our embodied citizenship. So drawing on that active citizenship lens. And what does that mean in primary education? And I think what we've seen, so we were funded by the ESRC. We've done a massive project looking at 2,000 primary schools and the curriculum offer across them, very much focusing on active citizenship. And we draw on Westheimer's model in terms of the idea of that you can have the really kind of contributory, kind of character orientated approach where we're taught to be a good citizen, and that's where we give to a food bank, or the participatory approach where we're taught to a bit like the example that was just given, where we're taught to kind of engage in a participatory kind of food drive, or the social justice orientated approach that says, okay, it's great to think about giving to a food bank, but let's also question how food poverty and why food poverty exists and what we can do as social actors to question and to combat that. And so for me, that's kind of the sphere that we look at this, is when we can combine that participatory kind of learning in education, but with that social justice orientation that says, well, and what can we do? What are the other, if I use food poverty as another example, what are the other answers to food poverty beyond charity and giving to the food bank? And what are the governmental responses that could be done differently? And I think that's sort of the lens that we look at this. So we see activism as kind of part of a spectrum of all of those other behaviours, from very kind of giving to charity right up to kind of involving yourself in campaigns and thinking about, well, how do children engage with this, and how do schools facilitate this?
Yeah, I think that's interesting, Ali, to think also then about what as a society we perceive to be good activism and to be like palatable. And then there's obviously the media has portrayed a particular type of activism as being bad and without much historical context in terms of that activism.
I think it ties directly into our idea of what the good citizen is, isn't it? I think we see, if I think from charitable giving point of view, we've all seen how children are portrayed in the media and by political voices who engage in, for example, the school's climate strikes. But if you're a young person who just goes out and fundraisers for a hospice for something, and I'm saying that's still good work, the portrayal of that individual is almost in direct odds to how if a child engages in some form of activism or campaigning, which again, I think is something we have to talk about in the education system.
Yeah, maybe Rowan, this is a good moment to talk about what you were doing this morning. I saw that, you know, you were sort of thinking about the like kind of how uncomfortable that experience is and was, and the sort of thought process. I don't know if that's something you wanted to share as a sort of precursor.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to. I think there's an obvious answer to what activism isn't, which is not just protest, which is what I was doing this morning. But I think that's an important perception, that activism equals protest, and that's why schools get so nervous around the concept of activism. This morning, I was doing a very, very peaceful, entirely silent protest to do with the erosion of trial by jury, which is something that I think is quite important to the right to a fair trial. I trained as a lawyer way back when. And I've done a lot of work around that kind of closure of civil society space, to use NGO speak, but you know, the erosion of our rights that we've seen in lots of different ways in this country. And I think one of the definitions of activism I would come to, and I like how Kimwe approached it, is around helping our communities to understand power and how to influence it, and understanding how to achieve change on issues we care about at a systemic level rather than just an individual level. And I think in the context of schools and education, helping children learn how to become citizens, not just consumers, because I think there's a real danger that you come to adulthood much more accustomed to engaging in the world as a consumer than as a citizen. And parents obviously play a really important role in helping children understand how they engage in that world. Schools are a hugely influential part of that, but making sure that parents come along as part of that journey and figuring out how school systems can engage parents along through that, I think is really important. And I think parents can also play a really important role in helping schools bring more activism content into school settings. I also want to kind of slightly broaden the definition of activism and remind us that, you know, at the moment in the UK, 3/4 of children spend less time outside than prisoners. This is a several years old study. So connecting to nature is activism in that context when you've got so much nature depletion. I think using our imaginations is activism, envisioning the world that we want to live in. I think embodied practices in a context when we've been taught that to experience the world first and foremost as a body, as living in a body, particularly a female body, and particularly a black or brown female body, is something that we're taught is a shameful thing to kind of to experience the world first and foremost in that way. So I think embodied practices and bringing that in more is also a form of activism. So activism can be very broadly defined, and I think breaking down some of the language that we use around it and helping people feel more comfortable in perceiving the world in different ways is really important.
I think that's really important. I'm going to throw it over to Emma, because I know Emma, you know, as a activist yourself, that sense of, you know, rest even being a form of activism. Yeah, anything against the grain, you know, behaving in a way that goes against the way that society expects and the norms of society is itself. I'm going to unmute you, Emma, so that you can share your yeah,
I mean, I think, you know, I completely agree with what everyone else has already said. But for me, like especially in the context of, you know, civilizational collapse, it's never been more important that we do interrogate what it does mean to be an activist. And for me, it's very much like a process of understanding the agency that you have, especially on like a local level, but connecting that to the global situation. But I think especially, yeah, for like young climate activists, there has been this kind of binary created between like good climate activists and bad climate activists. And I've kind of been, you know, by the media, I've been portrayed as both like the eco zealot, but also like the palatable person who can do things like, you know, sit on a stage and talk about how awful the situation is. And then everyone goes home and back to their normal lives. But, you know, being involved with just a poil and going on slow marches and having your face like on the Daily Mail and being called like an eco zealot, it's like, okay, so that's not good activism. But also even like in the media, it's kind of become very like commercialized and like tokenized. And it becomes a whole, you know, activist. It seems like you're either an activist or you're not. And you don't just wake up one day and it's like, oh, I'm an activist. It's actually, we need to get to the stage where it's not something that is just fit into like the current system and like marketized and everything. It needs to become a process where to be an activist is to be a human being, which is why like often when I'm asked to like write a bio, I say I am just like a human being. And this is just part of like my life. And I think we need to get to that stage, like especially with young people, where yeah, just caring isn't a whole role. It's not a job, it's something you're defined by. So yeah, and I think it's very hard, yeah, for like the current capitalist system to understand that people can do something and it's not monetized. So yeah, that's my hot take.
Thank you. So Amrita, as a kind of young person, what in a school environment, kind of what's your perceptions around activism and kind of how it's mediated to you?
I think I really agree with Emma's take on it, where we're kind of in school, we're taught that, you know, we're taught about climate change and we're taught about how it's bad. And then we're told like we need to do something about it, and then nothing is really done and there are no solutions given. And then if you want to do something about it, it has to be, you know, good activism, like peaceful activism, or, you know, just playing by the rules, I guess. Whereas I don't know if that really works a lot of the time. Like for example, the suffragettes were peacefully protesting for like a hundred years around. And their movement only started really taking up when violence was introduced. So I think it's important to recognize the efforts of individuals who just care and just do peaceful things, and that, you know, they need to be recognized so that bad activism doesn't take place, but then just action needs to happen.
It's interesting in the frame of what has become criminalized and what the limits of what people are actually physically allowed to do now. There was an interesting theatre production that I saw in kind of East London that mocked up a protest, and at the end of it they said if we had done this at the gates of 10 Downing Street we would have all been arrested, but within the context of this theatre space we're fine. And to think about how space and time maybe changes the dynamics of behavior. I think also the thing that comes to mind with me there is we're starting to talk about the commercialization of activism. Also, maybe what is government sanctioned activism from a school's perspective. We're now seeing this Climate Leaders Award, which is sort of seen as a kind of a badge that young people can achieve. I don't know if maybe Morgan, you've kind of got any thoughts about that.
I do. I know Emily, you put your hand up. I don't know whether you wanted to make a point before I jump in and move this on. Oh, yeah, good. Yeah, I think I mean, I'm many views about what the DfE are doing, and which are positive and negative. I think, I mean, we have to understand the context at the moment that there's a danger that teachers are going to be not allowed to strike because of the need to provide a minimum service, which is just a shocking attack on the ability to protest and to campaign, which isn't getting any media attention, which is, I guess, in some ways not surprising. I think relating to what Amrita was saying about what school is doing and how it's facilitating some types of activism or action on climate and preventing others, I know lots of people have covered this. This is where we're getting into conversations, I guess, around the purpose of education, what it's trying to do, what the education system is trying to do. And what we do as a charity, and I know that several others on this panel and in the audience will all be doing similar things, is trying to nurture young people's kind of agency and sense that they can be a change maker, and to understand what that is and to identify with that and to have the skills, have the confidence, have the solidarity to go and do that stuff. And we're nurturing, I think it's kind of called their agentic world making kind of ability. And the education system at the moment is quite individualizing. It doesn't really encourage people to act collectively, not even in their education. They don't tend to learn together and work in groups. That's been more and more eroded. And obviously we're all probably trying to help young people to experience what it's like to work in a group, to work with students just of different ages. Sometimes is quite novel for young people to experience these days. And if we're able to do these sorts of things and able to let young people to have more say over what they're learning and how they're learning, then when they have say over that, when they have that sort of freedom, they're naturally developing their agentic world making, because they are shaping their own world. They're shaping their own little life world in school. They're saying, I want to learn about this with these people in this way. And they might not be doing it in school, they might be doing it outside of school at the moment, but why not do it in school? If they're able to do that, then they develop what it feels like to be somebody who creates change or takes action, which in a culture and in an education system at the moment is kind of doing the opposite of that. It's kind of preparing young people for the future in a way that they're going to be kind of passive adapters to whatever risks are coming down the line. Like, I think there's an awareness within big education thinking that the world, we're coming out of a period of time where there has been a certain amount of stability politically, environmentally, and we're going into a period the rest of this century where it's going to be uncertain. We don't know what's down the track. We don't know if it's going to be 1.5 degrees of warming or 4 degrees of warming, and there's a huge difference between what that will mean for what the world looks like. And you can either set people up to kind of adapt to that in an individualistic way, or you can set them up to take action collectively to shape the world and hopefully make it better. So I'm not sure whether that's what DFE have got in mind with their Climate Leaders Award. We'll see, but hopefully young people will take that as a opportunity to try and push for examples of what change making actually looks like and what it means to be a climate leader.
I think that's a really important point, talking about society, so schools as a microcosm and kind of what we're preparing them for, and that dynamic, particularly then also with government in that as well. So Ali, I appreciate you just put your hand up. I don't know, Emily, did you want to go first there, and then we'll pass over to Ali?
Thanks. Yeah, so I just wanted to really pick up on what's sort of been said brilliantly already by Rowan and then Emma and now Morgan, just kind of bringing together this idea of like that it's about the school as a microcosm and young people as a sort of representative of what activism is on a human level, in terms of how we see it and how we are activists by changing our own outlook and how children see the world and how young people essentially ascribe value to life and to activities and things. And it just made me think of I've got a section at the end of, so this was one of the books that I've written, but this is one that's particularly about climate change and wildlife loss, and helping kids to understand that, and helping kids to make sense of not just what's going on and why it's happening, and combating sort of myths and the sort of misinformation and also the scaremongering, and saying, what's real and what's the truth. And I also work closely with a psychologist to really talk about, like, how do we inform and educate young people as to what's going on, so that there is a sense of agency and a sense of urgency, but without too much fear or anxiety, and so that there is truth telling without sort of myths and all this obfuscation that a lot of young people have, either being told over dramatic scary things, or being kind of fobbed off or told it's all fine. And if they've got one thing on the news and another thing from parents and another thing from teachers and another thing from people on TikTok, and they're sort of confused. And it just made me think of, so the last section of this book, I have a whole section on like what young people can actually do to help. And some of them are the sort of obvious things that we know about going green at home and looking at how you travel and talking to your parents about how they invest their money and stuff. But there's a section at the end on two things back to back, which are almost sort of opposing realities, but both hold, which one is that you don't have to do it all on your own. So this idea that, you know, you hear about everything that's going on and it's easy to think, gosh, how do I make a difference? So knowing that collective action does work, and I've written about examples that kids kind of engage with, like how when everyone got together to stop poaching of whales, then for their flesh, then actually the whale populations went back up, or when everyone got together to understand about CFCs in the 70s, and actually they did get removed, and the hole in the ozone is slowly recovering, and how when people come together, young people and old, we can make massive like global differences, and that young people need to understand that that is possible. But then following straight on, the next section is, remember, you don't have to do it all on your own, but you can make a difference. And it's holding those two opposing realities of the fact that you can't make a difference by yourself, but you can do something. And then just sort of finally, I just wanted to read you the very last two sentences, because it was such a beautiful segue from what Rowan said about like going for a walk in nature. So I wrote, spend time doing things you love, whether it's a walk in nature with your family or your dog, reading a book quietly on your own, or getting up to mischief with your friends. Perhaps you'll discover that you don't need far-flung holidays or more trendy clothes or computer games to be truly happy after all. And the most important thing that we can do is to be kind to each other and to all the creatures living on this planet. Let's work together to make the world a better place for us and for all the beautiful beings, large and small, that we share it with.
Thank you. It almost feels, Emily, like we could end there. But I really keen. I think out of these things, there's some really important strands coming. That sense of the dichotomy of individual versus kind of collective system change, and this sense that actually they're two sides of the same coin, and that actually, you don't do one or the other. It's a both that makes this happen. In a minute, I want to come to Paul and ask about that role of trade unions in helping bring about that collective action. But I know, Ali, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, and Emily, that sounds like a wonderful book that I think I'm going to order immediately. So thank you for sharing that. I wanted to go back to one of Morgan's points, actually, just about agency, and just to put a couple of kind of figures around some of this. So I'm really passionate about what happens in primary education. So I think if we can instill and get things right in primary education, and just, even if it's about critical curiosity, it's about feeling empowered, it really matters for what happens next. And all the research supports that. But what we're seeing in primary education is that's not happening. So less than half of schools will even engage in any form of social action. So their children have that opportunity. And of those half, less than half of those the children will have any agency about what's happening within the social action instead. So it can be very kind of imposed on them. And that isn't in any way to criticise teachers. We have interviewed over 100 teachers for this project, and they're all absolutely amazing in what they do. But there is so many kind of misunderstandings about what they are able to do, and space in the curriculum for this sort of activity as well. But even more concerning than that, I suppose, is that less than 15% of those children connect their actions with ideas of social or environmental justice. So actually, whilst we might be going out and doing social action such as Vitapik, the idea of then connecting that to wider ideas of climate change and what's actually happening or on the planet isn't happening as much. And so I think it's working through programs that really kind of support that. And what we have seen in this is that civil society organisations that work in partnerships with schools make a huge difference. If schools are working in partnership with an external organisation that's kind of focused on this, it kind of gives more of a legitimacy in having those social justice and participation type conversations. But at the moment, it's just simply not enough is happening. And final point to add to that is the inequalities in that. If you live in a privileged area, you are much more likely to have access to these opportunities than you live if you live in a more deprived area. So we're also seeing huge inequalities kind of playing out across the school system as well.
So hopefully we can come back to those two things, Ali, in a minute, in terms of sharing great examples of things happening that might then has potential to sort of roll on, and also that the last thing that we want to really explore is that how can we encourage and facilitate more in schools, and I guess that sense of inequality and trying to challenge that. If if there are ways that people think we can do that, then possibly that's somewhere we can go. Paul.
Yeah, just pick up on two things. I mean, Morgan was talking about not being sure about which way we're going. I mean, I think it's very clear how wherever we're going, it's going to get worse. So I've been saying this thing lately that in retrospect, the past feels a lot safer than it did at the time. But the future, I think, we're heading in for, a very, very turbulent period, and we're already in it. And I think you've got two reflexes from the people in power when we got that. One is to actually close down democratic space. So, like, as we see with Prevent and things like that, and the definition of extremism that they're floating about now, which is any challenge to existing British institutions. So, that's fairly clear where that's going. But the other reflex is to individualise, as people were saying about the nature of the curriculum, Michael Gove's lonely scholar learning lists, which is the way we all learn, and to institutionalise, so that things like a climate award or something like that becomes something that's, you get a gong from a member of the royal family or something like that. It's so it all becomes a bit retro. But I think that the key thing is exactly what Emily was just saying, that it's about collective organisation. It's about creating citizens, not consumers. Somebody else said that as well. I think that was Ali. People who are active, trying to make a better society, not people who are just after how high can I go up, because that's a unsustainable model. So in terms of the unions on this, I think this is absolutely crucial from the point of view of the staff, but also that can be a point of support for students. Though, where you have strong union organisation isn't necessarily where you've got strong student organisation. But we're working on a whole series of things on green bargaining strategies, around transition at school level. How do you negotiate a school net zero plan? This is very early days for us doing this, but this is the discussion that's going on in the union at the moment. And whether you want green reps to do that, whether you put it into health and safety or just your average rep does it, but it's something you seek to collectivise with your members. You have a meeting on it so everybody shares the perspective, and that feeds into what you want the school to do. Because the thing about the DFE's net zero strategy, which was a response to the student strikes, to actually defuse them, in my view, was a number of initiatives, but they've done it as things you can join if you want to. So you can sign up to the National Nature Park if you want to, or you're supposed to have a sustainability lead, but there's no real guidance on what that looks like. And what we're pushing for is actually a sustainability team for every school, which has somebody from management, somebody representing the unions, somebody representing the students, as a basic, core thing. So you've got something that mobilizes the school as a community, and that can then have an impact into the wider community. So that's the sort of thing we're trying to work on.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I know, Emma, you wanted to bring in maybe the sort of parallels with universities and for university students, and maybe there's sort of lessons that can be learned maybe from universities, or maybe there's sort of things in common.
Yeah, I mean, especially at my university, University of Exeter, where I'm the president of the student union there. we've got this massive hypocrisy, really, because Exeter is home to, you know, some of the top climate scientists worldwide, even though those rankings are based on like very biased like factors. So we've got, you know, some of the most amazing climate scientists, amazing climate research, and all of like it's where all of like the innovations and the technology is, you know, coming out of. But at the same time, a lot of that is being funded by Shell, and the University of Exeter is tops the rankings in terms of taking money from fossil fuel companies for research, and that's why like some of our activism as students at the student union has been focused on you know, ending and calling out that kind of blatant hypocrisy and greenwashing. But at the same time, the university will offer students like opportunities to be, yeah, like climate champions, you know, green consultants on very small things, and it kind of feels like a distraction. It's like, go worry about our recycling bins. Meanwhile, we will be in a 15-year partnership with one of like the most horrendous climate criminals known to history, right? For 15 years, which is crazy. But yeah, at the same time, it's like, come on, you can get your like award, your green award, and you can put it on your CV, and you can go and participate in the capitalist society once you leave our institution. And if you protest about it, you will face disciplinary action, which is what happened to me. So it's like you actually try and get out of like the box of, you know, the norm, and it feels like universities, maybe schools. I mean, the last thing that I remember from school was like watching a David Attenborough documentary and being like, oh, it's sad, isn't it? All like the ice melting away. Didn't really learn anything about climate change at school, but it feels like, yeah, it's just they're trying to keep us in the box, and it's like they're starting to push on the edges, but it's like, no, we can't push on the edges. And as soon as you have students, young people actually being like, that box, like we're not going to achieve anything, and they're actually trying to do something, it's like, no, they're going to use the powers that they have. And I guess that's also why like activism in the schools is so controversial, and it's scary to like, it is scary to try and change things, especially when you're young people and you've got like your future ahead of you, and you're part of like an institution which you're trying to get something from. So yeah, so that's a lot of words.
But no, I think you're kind of pulling at maybe the power dynamics of this, that there's a power imbalance, that the university, the institution, the school itself has a power influence over the students, you know, the people that it's sort of engaging with, and to what extent that, which way around that power dynamic works. I maybe there's a question in this as well of is litter picking and recycling a form of activism, or is that something maybe we can put in the bin itself?
I mean, just to come back on that, like I started my journey with litter picking in my like community. So I think, you know, one day you're litter picking, the next day you're like on the Daily Mail for slow marching with just a poil. So like never underestimate the power of that, like of that escalator to like doing whatever. But equally, even like litter picking, you're making that connection to like your local community, you start to care about it, you start to observe things more. And then you decide to join the biggest, you know, civil disobedience group in the UK. So
yeah, I'm glad you came back at me with that. Maybe this is a good transition to then think about examples that we know working, and maybe to try and think what are the common themes. So as much as sort of describing what that example might be, and Ali, I thought maybe is there work that you might kind of be able to draw on from the primary level, because actually that might be seen, particularly in what Emma's just said there about a building block, you know, as sort of foundation to develop this.
What Ella just said was absolutely brilliant, and I'd love to quote that at some point in terms of as the access route. And I think that is the really important conversation here, is thinking about, we talk quite a lot about the civic journey in our work, and in terms of actually a 4 or 5-year-old kind of using literature to kind of extend the moral imagination, to extend critical curiosity, to learn from picture books and around, and start asking those questions, and how maybe later in sort of key stage 2 that becomes more about social action, which may well be the litter picking, but actually that being an ongoing journey, and the importance of where schools then scaffold around that our idea of what it means, of our citizenship, what democracy is, what having a voice in democracy means, and what we've seen in schools. So we're now doing, we're in the 3rd stage of our ESRC project, and we're in 10 case study schools where we feel that they are really highlighting and really focusing on civic education in kind of all different sorts of ways. But what we do find in those schools is those children and young people are so much more confident with their civic, political and social literacies, understanding and being able to talk, being able to use the language of activism, being able to use the language of kind of critical engagement and kind of knowing their rights, and accepting, sort of thinking about their own responsibilities within that as well. And so it's where schools, and there isn't a one size fits all by any means, but we've seen schools, for example, that maybe are working in partnership with organisations such as Citizens UK, and actually engaged in community organising, and the children having real agency in that. We've seen schools who are really prioritise art and literature and use art and literature to explore their role within society, and the things that they really care about and things that they're really passionate about, and how they can put that into action. So for example, creating raps about things that they're really passionate about. And so I certainly think in the early years that we're looking at the moment, I think that's the kind of foundation area about building kind of our understanding of some of this. So yes, I would never want to criticize the litter pick, but I do think the litter pick has to be linked to our kind of wider understanding of community and kind of environmental and social issues.
Okay, Amrita, do you want to, is this moment to talk a bit more about the scorecards that you're engaged with?
Yeah, so I joined Teach the Future in July of this year, and so we're working currently on a project related with the general election. It's called Is Climate on Their Cards? So it's kind of, we're going to rate MPs on their kind of position on climate change and what they want to do or incorporate with it. And yeah, I think it's important because it's connecting schools, or rather like school students, with politics, which will hopefully influence actual change.
Yeah, and I think that the general election is a really interesting moment, because obviously it doesn't come around that frequently, though maybe it does, but also that sense of young people, yeah, if you're under the age of 18, not being able to vote, but to what extent you should be engaged in that process. And this, you know, what you've just talked about there sounds like a great way to engage young people as part of that process. Rowan, yeah.
I'd love to jump on that. So Amrita, firstly, I'm interested to connect on that because Parents for Future is doing similar work to figure out what the parent demographic can do around the general election. But also an example I came across recently that I just loved of how young people can be engaged around elections is from somebody I know who's doing work in Canada, where I think it's in some of their regional elections. It's not, I think, in their national elections. But when they're having elections, the kids vote first. So the politicians go into the schools and they talk to the kids about what the manifestos are, and they run an election. They bring in the ballot boxes and all of the students get to vote. And then the outcome of the student vote is made public so that the adults get to know what the young people have voted for ahead of the adults voting, which I think is just such a beautiful mechanism of helping young people have a voice in elections where they don't get an actual legal vote, but there is a way to engage them in that. So there are creative ways that you can engage young people around kind of citizenship in elections. And I'd love to see those sorts of things being tried in the UK. Are there ways that anyone can do that? Throwing the idea out to everyone on this call, please pick it up and run with it.
Yeah, it almost feels like there needs to be an organisation that runs with that, and it just happens widespread, every school.
It's such a great concept.
Imagine if there was a BBC TV program with the, what is it, the swingometer, and it was the school's perspective. It was the student vote. You know, what did that look like, or what would it look like? Was anyone wanting to follow from that? Yeah, Amrita, yeah.
We have a person very influential in our organization, Charlie Clift. And he kind of mentions pester power a lot, which is how children can influence their parents or carers to vote by kind of sharing their perspective. So I think pester power is something that we have here, even though it's not as official, it's still something that influences voting.
Morgan, what about some of the examples that you've been involved with? Are there any strands that you think are really effective ways to be able to engage young people in what we might term the activism?
I think I won't go into specific examples. I think it's more about that development, that nurturing of the feeling that you can be an activist and you can create change. I think is really what is at the heart of everything we do. So we use the Peter Sartorus's model, which is grasp, care, imagine, communicate, and act. And those are things which we want young people all to be able to do. They want to grasp an understanding of the issues, to connect to care about them, to imagine alternative futures, communicate those, and to take action on them. So that's what we're doing through all of it. And I think, yeah, we definitely run into those issues which have been described several times here, that there's levels of kind of radicalness that both young people and their teachers are comfortable doing. And what we try to do, I guess, is to not let the teachers get too worried about what the actual issue is, the topic is, because often it can scare them off and think, oh, we better not go down this territory. I might get in trouble, even just with my head of department, let alone the head teacher, governors, Ofsted, and so on. And so we actually put more emphasis on young people deciding which issue they want to work on, what topic's important to them, and then just having the experience of working together on a collective action task, and not worrying too much about whether they're successful or not, because we have to not put too much pressure on young people anyway. I mean, there's huge changes that need to happen in the education system, and it's not down to young people to make those changes or to call or drive those changes. It's up to us to do that. And, you know, Global Action Plan as an organization is shifting more and more towards being a campaigning organization and making big calls and trying to work with others who recognize the need for system change in education, which is not just because of the climate crisis, because of inequality, poverty, lack of democracy, etc. There's many reasons why it needs to change, and we have many allies and who want to see, more democracy in education, more decentralization of power in education, more teachers having more say. So we're not necessarily trying to create kind of activism which has outcomes, but it's more about creating opportunities for young people to experience what it's like to take action and to learn through doing that. So activism as education.
Yeah, so more about giving space and giving permission for these things, and it being quite open-ended, rather than being prescriptive around what it is. But I find that really interesting as well. You're saying about that, not putting the pressure on young people to say, let's do something that then you create the change, instead just involving them in a wider process around kind of thinking critically that then might lead to adults and society changing, rather than young people having to affect that change themselves. So
yeah, that's it, and them enjoying it. And I think, we are moving into an uncertain and scary world, but the world right now is terrible for lots of people in this country. There's a lot of poverty. There's people who can't afford to eat, regular meals. And so when we think about what the future holds and what we're preparing young people for, there is hope in that as well, because there's people who they're hoping that it will get better for them, and that will be the result of greater justice and greater equality. And we can drive towards that even within a world where we're experiencing climate catastrophe and nature breakdown. There's still opportunity for more equality, and that will improve people's lives. And so this is part of it, is that young people need to enjoy the process of taking action so that they can have some hope for the future, and that the world can get better. Because I do believe it still can get better, even despite all the challenges we face.
I think maybe that brings in strands of sort of joy as a form of activism and the human connection of this. And we've talked already about that sort of connecting with the rest of nature, but maybe that those being parts of this jigsaw. Paul, can I throw it to you just in terms of, I know you've written quite widely about that impartiality element and the teacher concern that maybe Morgan was sort of mentioning, that sense of often teachers are quite uncomfortable to explore this. What kind of advice do you give to educators? Let me make sure, there you are. You should be able to speak now.
Yeah, it's done it. Okay. It's a tricky thing. It depends. A lot of it depends on what the management is like. You know, if you've got a management that is open to doing something like this, and an even better one that is actually, you know, leading on this. I mean, there are some fantastic head teachers out there who are really blazing a trail on it. And what's tragic is that they're not brought together and celebrated as a kind of, you know, this is what everybody needs to be doing. You know, it's just seen as, oh well, you know, you get on with your thing. If you've got that, then there's space to do it. If you've got somebody who's, you know, in you know, your head teacher is rather resistant and a bit nervous, then it's a bit uphill. But the thing is, I mean, impartiality, the definition of impartiality, it's actually a bit of a movable feast. I mean, if you actually read the document, they don't say that teachers aren't allowed to state their personal view. You can state your personal view, but you can say, look, this is what I think, but there are other views available. Other people think X or Y. And the idea is you're supposed to have balance, but then what's balance? In this context, in the context of climate breakdown, you're looking at the fact, you know, the definition of impartiality and balance is, and partisan is in very narrow parliamentary terms. You know, it's, do you support this party's manifesto or that party's manifesto? Obviously, you know, teachers aren't going to go in with rosettes on, you know, but it's where nobody has got all the answers. You know, it's a different question where actually the demands of the science, if you like, the social and political demands of the science actually burst the bounds of mainstream politics, which this does. Then there's the distinction, it seems to me, comes in between impartiality and objectivity. You know, you've got to present students with the facts and some of the choices and some of the debates. And again, coming back to the impartiality guidance, it says debates are good. So I think, yep, let's have lots and lots of debates, because that's what we need about this, because nobody's got all the answers. We're making it up as we go along. We've not had this problem before. So, you know, let's actually have those debates. And I think, again, going back to the previous point I was making, if you've got strong collective organisation around this, that helps as well. If your school union group has taken a position on it, you're in a stronger position. So, you know, I think collectivise and just push.
I was going to jump over to Emily. That was all really helpful, Paul. But I was wondering, Emily, in terms of your writing and the sort of work you've done in the academic space, have you ever had these sorts of thoughts in that kind of concern or worry, and how do you kind of explain those?
Sorry, can you clarify what you're asking?
So in terms of teachers, often they're worried to say anything because they think I might say the wrong thing. And also they kind of, Paul was explaining there that the debate is about how we respond to the climate and nature emergency rather than the science of it happening. So teachers are comfortable with that bit of it, but to then move on to the sort of how we respond to it, you know, in the sort of spheres that you operate, how do you kind of frame those things about the response bit?
I mean, I'm not a teacher, so I'm probably not the best person to ask on that topic.
But in terms of writing your book and things, I was thinking, like, did you have these thoughts about to what extent could you suggest these things, or did you feel free to just kind of feel like, oh, you know, the things that I believe in, I'm going to put in this book?
in terms of action.
Yeah.
I mean, there are various sort of actions that are kind of across the board that are kind of agreed that we can all do that would help. But like, I think the thing that mostly I've emphasized in my writing and also in the work I've done as an activist is about collective action. It's about like saying, well, there's only so much that we can do as individuals, but that actually what we really need to be doing is looking at coming together and putting pressure on the higher powers. And how do we do that? Through our voting power, through our power to like write to MPs, even as children, through our power to kind of show the higher powers what we are willing to change about our lifestyles, because there's this constant sort of idea really that, well, the politicians say, well, we can't change these things because the consumers, the voters don't want it. And then the voters say, well, we can't do anything because the politicians aren't making the changes. So it's sort of breaking that cycle and saying, well, as adults, but also as young people and as adults who are either parents of or teachers of or connected to young people, how can we like inspire young people to make changes that are visible that then like can essentially kind of change the climate of the climate kind of thing. Yep. Change the how we are seen and how we're seen as consumers and just people on the planet, and helping young people to kind of know that it's not, yes, just about the specific actions going green and all that, but that actually that is more of a representation of then big businesses and government seeing that we're willing to make changes. And I think explaining to young people so that they have an understanding of what's going on. And I've been reading the chats, though I was slightly distracted. So there's like talk of like, what do we do about climate anxiety and kind of scaremongering? And in my experience, most young people, I've done a lot of talks and shows in schools based on my book and based on sort of generally kind of like talking about fun science stuff and sort of like interspersing it with kind of what's really going on the planet and how can we make sense of that and what's true and what isn't true. And the biggest thing that I've found in my school's work is that it's the kids that are coming up to me with the really deep questions and knowing far more about it than their teachers and usually their parents. And they're wanting to know what's true and what's real, and that actually it's really important that we tell them the truth, that we simplify it, but not dumb it down. So there's a difference between making something simplify or simplistic and simple. And actually it is simple. It is pretty, Einstein said, if you can't explain it in one sentence, you don't understand it well enough. I mean, that's, perhaps slightly ambitious, but I kind of like to think of it like that. It's like, okay, what's going on? How do we know it's our fault? What can we do to help? And then actually a big piece of activism is then talking to your parents about it and telling them that you want to know the truth and that you can handle it. Can you handle the truth? Well, yeah, actually far better than kind of not being sure and speculation and worrying and kind of half truths and kind of like fobbing off, because then kids just kind of don't know where they are, and they'd much rather know what's going on and know that what's needed is to really showcase to adults and the change, the people who are in charge of making the change, that change is wanted and why, and that it's absolutely certain that this is a priority and that this is what we need to do. So it's about saying like, these are the facts, this is the reality, and this is the hope, and this is where we're already, all the positive things that are already happening. I've got a whole huge chunk in my book about all the beautiful, inspiring stories of change that are already happening, not just past ones, but actually to do with the current crisis, that it is possible to make change, that those changes are happening all over the globe. This is how to get involved in those. But more importantly, it's about just showing that that is what we want and that that's what we're looking to, and that's the future that we're visioning. And it's, coming back to what Rowan said, it's just holding that all in mind of saying, what is the future that we want, and like living into that as a vision.
Yeah, that future thinking, I think, is an important one. Sorry, Emily, I don't think where I was going with that as well was, I think, off the back of COP28, there are these kind of comments around abated and unabated fossil fuels and kind of what change we need to see and what is the solution and what isn't. And it feels like we're moving to a space where there's a lot of debate around what the action and what the effective actions are. And I wonder that then, you know, as a scientist, you can kind of say, well, no, this is what we need to do and these are the solutions. But it feels like politically there is people are questioning those things. And I don't know if that has kind of come across you.
I don't think I can answer that. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a climate scientist.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, Ali, shall I throw over to you?
I definitely don't think I can answer that question.
No, we'll leave that. We'll park that one.
But I did want to just sort of follow up on what Emily was saying in terms of just saying that actually for me, some of the really good news about this is if we can free teachers up to feel more freedom to do this within the curriculum, teachers are ideally placed. So when we look at teachers, they are more civically active than the general population. They are more likely to take part in campaigns and protests. They're more likely to take part in even in voting and giving to charity and volunteering. So actually what we've got is a really kind of great group of kind of civic role models. And for me, it's partly, but whenever we talk to teachers, it is about loosening up the curriculum, loosening up the ties on them, and them feeling more confident about being able to kind of express it. So I do think there's a lot of hope in this area. I think it's just about mobilising some of that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good, almost starting to sum up a little bit there, Ali, is that, yeah, and I saw that in the comments as well, someone talking about opening up the conversation. It's about starting a conversation. Rowan, maybe this links to some of the work, yeah, that you're moving towards.
It does, it links brilliantly. So I'd love to just amplify some of what Emily was saying around visibility of action, because I think making sure that any action that we take is visible is hugely important. And also some of the comments and that Emily was talking about a bit around climate anxiety. Because I think there's a risk that if we're encouraging children towards more climate action, or young people or students of any age group, but they're not seeing the adults they trust in their life also taking climate action, there's a real risk that we're going to make them feel more alone and more responsible for solving this huge thing that we've just told them is really big and really devastating. So I think there's a really important element of role modeling, of finding ways for adults to engage as well. And I think seeing schools particularly as a community space that's not just about the students, but that also involves the families that sit around the schools is really important for anybody that is thinking about engagement around climate issues, because the families play a really significant role in helping children understand, for example, the efficacy of climate action. And then there's some interesting research around kind of how children understand risk, how children understand efficacy, and a lot of that comes from how their parents are engaging around those issues. On conversations specifically, yes, we're doing a lot of work around climate conversations at the moment, because there's research from some of Climate Outreach's work, which was saying that I think it's around 76%, I think, of people are kind of concerned or very concerned about climate, but 58% of people talk about climate rarely or never. So there's this huge silence around climate across the population, and that is included within families. There's also research about how often people talk about climate within family contexts and how often people feel comfortable talking to their children about climate, and it's really low. The figures are consistently really low, slightly variable across age groups, but far lower than the levels of concern we see. So I think helping people just know how to have a conversation is really powerful, and that helps to get past the silence, and that helps to make visible and to make known how concerned we all are about climate. So that's one of the projects that we're working on. We're doing a pilot at the moment on a very small scale to understand actually what's the impact if we support people and give them some training around how to have conversations about climate. What does that do? Does it just mean that climate becomes a more salient issue? Does it start to change people's behaviours? Are there other impacts that we're seeing from that? And that's something that we're looking to scale up next year, hopefully ahead of the general election. We'll see when the election is. We'll see if we manage to get it scaled in time. But yes, I think conversation is really impactful.
I think that referencing the climate outreach research and the work that they do, I think is really important in framing how we explore these and sort of understanding the messaging. And what comes to mind with that as well is the clunkiness of the language. I think we're all familiar with the idea that actually the terms like climate crisis or climate emergency or climate change are all quite limiting in their terminology, and that this issue is so kind of all-encompassing. We've already mentioned aspects of kind of social justice that actually are fundamental to this, and that maybe some of the challenges are in the language we use and finding a kind of appropriate terminology to be able to explain the things that we want to be talking about and then open up that conversation. I don't know if anyone else on the panel had anything about that kind of language and terminology.
I think it's also about how we connect it, how we talk about climate change. We can talk about it as a problem, but we can also talk about it as a symptom, because it ultimately is a symptom of an economic and social and cultural system that we live in which there's also many other symptoms which are having negative effects on people's lives. And so when we talk about climate change without talking about the deeper systemic causes of it, which also cause other issues which people are concerned with in their daily lives, and it's harder for people to see how they can take action on it. When you can connect it and talk about it as a symptom and connect it to other issues that people are worried about and see and connect to the roots of the problem, of the roots of what's causing climate change, which are effectively consumerism is one of the key drivers of it, and start talking about how consumerism is also causing mental health issues, mental health crises and so on. Consumerism is also causing huge social justice issues in the global south. And these are issues that all need solving by tackling root causes, and we can find root solutions if we look at the values level and how our systems are being foundations of the systems, and then you're able to engage people in solutions which cover more than just climate change, which is what's ultimately needed.
So I'm keen in a minute, we'll come to Paul, but I just wanted to give everyone on the panel a chance to think about maybe something that's really positive, maybe to talk about something that gives them hope in this space and something they're involved with that they think actually that keeps me driving forwards and kind of moving on, and that's the bit that I'm excited about. So just to give people a chance to think about that, I'm keen to come to Paul and hear from you, but also I'm also conscious that maybe there's more space in terms of young people and kind of their responses to this. And I don't know, Amrita, if you wanted to kind of respond to some of what's been said in terms of from a young person's perspective. So I'll just go to Paul first of all.
Very briefly, I think what all this indicates is there's a lot of problems with people not actually knowing what the terms mean. Just transition is one that we use a lot in the trade union movement, but an awful lot of people don't know what it means. And there's lots of definitional discussion about it. Green jobs. Prospect did a survey, and people were very, very vague about what they thought a green job was and whether it might apply to them. So all of that comes back to, again, a governmental failure to implement Article 12 of the Paris Agreement, which is to actually conduct a massive public information campaign so that everybody understands what's going on. And they're not doing it. None of them are doing it. And I think that's something we've really got to actually get done. Actually, that's something we've got to get done from a governmental level, whoever's in government. I mean, I dread to think how this government would frame it, but that's something we need to do. Sorry.
I similarly, Paul, thought, during the COVID experiences, we sort of doubled down in terms of education on the process of teaching and learning that had kind of become very common, rather than saying we could pause that. This is an opportunity to think about something completely different, and imagine if everyone had been enabled within their local community to suddenly become really active within kind of positive actions within the local community. I often feel like that was maybe a missed opportunity. Amrita, I wanted to throw it over to you if there were any thoughts that you might have.
About what? Sorry.
Just in terms of young people and maybe your experience within your peers, about is the reality that this isn't on the radar of most people, and that or kind of those sorts of senses maybe.
I think it's often a bit scary how not a lot of people are concerned or aware of climate change, and I think not making climate education fun, or maybe how it's meant to be in nature or outdoors, that would change things up and then make them a bit different so that people would actually take notice, because especially as Paul said, about how people don't know about the language, and even more so like in schools and secondary schools, some of the language is kind of taken at face value and not really understood. So people might hear about the climate crisis, but they'll just roll their eyes. And I think, yeah, and green jobs, they aren't spoken about enough. So it's just all kind of an issue of a lack of solutions and a lack of maybe interest even.
That sounds interesting. It kind of links with that public education kind of idea more broadly. Okay. I was going to say thank you so much for all of the input. I know you know that we're never going to kind of explore this in its entirety, and we would need a day and more. And but, you know, thank you so much for all of the inputs. I'm keen to go around the group though, and to kind of leave with a positive note of kind of what's the thing that you're really yeah, enthusiastic about. Maybe Rowan, can I start with you?
Sure. I think top of my mind at the moment, because of a fellowship project that I run globally, is all of the work that's happening around the world in this space. There's so many people that are trying to find ways to engage through schools, communities. In the last couple of weeks, I've talked to people in Ghana, Uganda, Australia, Canada, Vietnam, Indonesia, who are all finding ways to engage through school communities. And I think that looks different in every country, because what's possible in education systems in every country looks different. But that gives me hope. And that a lot of that, South Africa comes to mind again, has a spiritual element. That there's an element in there that's about connecting to yourself deeply and connecting to your place deeply and understanding the world around us as a living entity. And that feels powerful.
Thank you. Morgan.
I think my openness comes from the emergence of our ability to trust each other is growing. It feels there's a groundswell of deliberative democracy and citizens' assembly and people understanding what those are, and what that essentially means is that we're getting more comfortable with decentralizing power and trusting that people are good deep down and aren't necessarily selfish deep down. And I think that my hope is that as that becomes a more mainstream view, that we're going to see a change in the education system where governments come to realize that motivating teachers through extrinsic rewards only, so through pay and status and fear, isn't effective. And if you really want them to get from good enough to great, as the IPPR say, you need to tap into their intrinsic motivations, because they actually care and they actually want to see the world get better. And most teachers are like that, as Ali said before. And I think my hope is that, yeah, these narratives around us being citizens and not consumers, like John Alexander said, are really starting to get traction now. And I see that as being pointing the way towards a new forms of democracy taking hold, even though at the moment it feels like we're losing democracy. It feels like, because things have come so extreme the other way, that we'll get past that and we will have a more democratic society, which I think is ultimately what's needed for sustainability education, environmental education to thrive.
Thank you. Ali?
I think for mine, I'm actually going to go into more my personal life rather than my professional. So I run an organisation. I founded it with my husband, a community conservation organisation where we bring together schools, intergenerational groups. We work with refugees, asylum seekers, and we bring everyone together to work around nature and helping the local environment. And I think the power that we've seen, particularly with children and young people, kind of engaging in that, and how empowered children have felt from both kind of having that experiential hands-on learning, love of nature, but then also taking it back to their own community and environments. I think alongside all my research says when we really concentrate on this, it works. And actually we can bring communities and families together to kind of tackle this. And so actually, and it's not that hard, it's just about giving everyone the permission and schools the permission to kind of drive some of this forwards. And so I think that gives me hope that actually the solutions are there. We just need to get us the momentum towards them.
Paul?
Yeah, it's just that more and more people all sorts of different levels are stepping up and taking action on this question. It's building. Yeah, I mean, it's not like when you had the big school strikes and so forth, but I'd say at a kind of more kind of bit by bit, unit by unit, right across the country level, it's actually much more deeply implanted, and people are chipping away at all sorts of different levels on this. And I think we are getting somewhere, and we're networking a lot more, we're connecting a lot more. The movement is, as we say, a many-headed genius. So we're creating the future.
Thank you. Emily.
I just loving what everyone said, and I was also watching the chat boxes and something. I'm just loving what everyone's written, and someone wrote just now a quote about being stubbornly optimistic in the today, and I love that expression of stubborn optimism. And what gives me hope, particularly again going back to when I go into schools and talk with young people, and particularly like primary age children, what gives me real hope is like asking them questions about climate change that there's no way that I knew the answer to a few years ago, let alone most of the adults on the planet today. And that's only because I've been deeply immersed in this stuff for the last 4 or 5 years. But asking young people questions about, what is a greenhouse gas and what is climate change and why is it happening? And they know the answers. They know it and they're excited about it. And it's just so much part of their world now. And I say, what are some things you can do to help? And they all know, RRR, reduce, reuse, recycle. And they're talking about different things. They're asking really intelligent questions that often the teachers are just kind of going, God, I don't know where they got that from, sort of thing. So that's what gives me hope, is that not just that young people know so much, but that it's becoming more normalized within a school environment to have an awareness of it's just part of what young people know about. And again, I saw that what really gave me huge hope was, being asked to do the Regenerators BBC Bite Size series that was mentioned at the beginning, and that I was a writer and consultant for, is that mainstream media outlets are really putting climate change, wildlife loss, ecosystem collapse kind of just on the kind of normalization. This is just what's real. This is just what's there. It's just, so it's slow, but even in the course of the last 5 years, since I sort of got full on activism, I feel like there's the most enormous change that's taken place. And I do think, and I have to just say this, that a huge part of that change in public awareness and the shift in the Overton window of what's discussed in Parliament, etc., or what's even thought of by the public, is to do with protest. It is to do with activism. And you can look at all the charts and you can look at all the data and see when those public opinions changed and when people started voting differently or putting climate change sort of as a priority in their voting and in their daily lives. And it is in response to main large-scale protest groups, Extinction Rebellion to be specific. That's where I am, and I think that's evidence that it's making a huge difference, and that we need to keep going, and we need to keep gathering more collective pressure, putting Just Stop Oil, all of these protest groups do make a difference. Yes, they're controversial to some, but they do make a difference, and I think that's what's really important. Okay, we haven't solved it, but if you just think back 3-4 years ago, as in terms of climate change ever being discussed on the news or talked about anywhere mainstream, and it just wasn't ever. 2019, 2018 was probably when it really shifted, and that was in direct response to the big Extinction Rebellion protests that inspired me. Emma talked about 1 minute I was litter picking, the next minute I was, Just Stop Oil. I had a similar story. 1 minute I went to Extinction Rebellion protests in 2018 to support Kinway, who was playing in the samba band, and within a few months I'd just gone oh my God, I'm a scientist, I'm a science communicator, and there is nowhere else now in the world where I feel it has integrity for me to put my energy, because I've literally just gone, what? Why don't we all know this? So it's it can happen that quickly, and if it can happen that quickly to Emma, to me, to all of us, then it can happen that quickly to everybody. If everyone wakes up and then takes action and then puts pressure on those at the top, then it could all change very quickly.
Yeah, It is. Emily, what you're speaking is perfect. Emma.
What gives me hope at the moment is my mum, for many reasons. Firstly, she's like a secondary school teacher, and she's starting to make moves in getting like the Teach the Teacher campaign going at her school, which is really cool, which is in short like the SOS UK equipping like young people to basically upskill the teachers about climate education. But also because back in 2021, when I was at COP26, basically penultimate day of me being there, I was just so frustrated and so like filled with climate anxiety because it was just so depressing. I set up like a repair cafe with my mum. And yeah, like seeing how quickly my mum has kind of, you know, she wouldn't call herself an activist at all, but she is an activist. You know, she's gone vegan. She's now like basically running the repair cafe. She's getting young people involved. And just seeing that, and even like in my close family, you know, it's not like I've been, you know, pushing them saying like you need to do this, you need to do that, but just seeing like the change that can happen on a small scale, like with your close friends, with your family, with the people you work with even, I think it's amazing what, you know, one person can do. And it's just like, yeah, creating those ripples, and soon like the ripples meet and then we create waves. So yeah.
Thank you. Amrita.
Something that gives me hope. I mean, I think the example that was already given of the Montreal Protocol, where the whole world basically united on banning CFCs. I think it's something that's a good example of how change can happen. It's just getting solutions out there, and yeah, and also more activism in schools and in our organization, the general election campaign, and how everyone's kind of getting involved with it.
Great. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming along and giving up, you know, sort of your evenings to kind of come together. And, you know, just as people have said, I think that's testament itself, kind of showing people's commitment and enthusiasm. We've got 15 examples in that shared document of some really good projects and kind of activities going on around the UK and around the world. All of the things that we talked about in terms of projects and all of the organisations that are involved here and the sort of things and initiatives, I'll make sure that gets shared with everyone afterwards. We'll have the recording that will go up on YouTube. So hopefully everyone's got something out of this. I know, you know, this has been a really rich discussion for me and for the work that we're doing with the Ministry of Education. This is definitely something we're constantly thinking about and trying to inform our work. Let's hope that you know, even if you've just made one connection or seen one thing, you know, that's kind of worth it in itself. So thank you so much, everyone, and hopefully we'll all connect again, maybe even in person in the future. So thank you so much.